Millionaire secretly helped a poor family. They found out who he really was, and the truth shocked them. Hello, friends. We present our new story. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the bell, like, and share your opinion in the comments. When Max opened another report from his company, his gaze unintentionally caught on a small folder lying aside on the table. It wasn't part of the current business, but stood out among the other documents. The folder was stamped, "Case closed." Max sighed, knowing the contents were related to something he tried not to think about. It was a part of his past he could never forget. Memories resurfaced against his will. Roaring engine, blinding headlights, a scream and silence. He shook his head, driving away the vision. The folder remained at the edge of the table, as if a reminder of the burden he carried, even if no one else knew about it. It was precisely because of this guilt that Max had long since begun helping people. Most of his charitable donations were anonymous. He believed money could soften the impact of his mistakes, though he understood it could never fully right them. Recently, his attention was caught by one family. It was a case he had heard about from employees of the charity he worked with. A disabled man, a little girl who had spent a long time in the hospital, and a woman who was holding on by a thread. Max decided to help them, but not just with money. He wanted to do something more. He transferred money to the charity's account with instructions to direct it towards the girl's treatment and rent for the family. Then he arranged for repairs in their dilapidated apartment. Of course, this was done through intermediaries as well. He didn't need to know their names or see their faces. He was afraid of that. But one day, a strange feeling overtook him. Why did this particular family touch him so deeply? Why did he feel a keen desire to do everything possible for them? Amy sat on the living room couch, sorting through documents. Copies of hospital bills, overdue utility bills, bank notices of debts. Her eyes stopped on one paper, a payment report that had settled their biggest debts several months ago. This payment had come unexpectedly. Amy tried to find out who their benefactor was, but no clues emerged. Only the charity's name appeared on all documents, but they refused to disclose the sponsor's name. Probably just a kind person, she thought then, deciding to stop trying to find out the truth. But now, as Annie was recovering and their lives were slowly stabilizing, the payment gnawed at her mind. Amy felt there was more behind it than just generosity. "Amy," Dan called quietly from the bedroom. His voice was weak, as it had been in recent months. She got up and went to him. Dan lay on the bed, staring tiredly at the ceiling. After the accident, his body no longer obeyed him, and his soul was tormented by guilt. "Have you heard about the streets being closed again in the city?" he asked. "No, what happened? They say that businessman, what's his name, Max White, will be speaking at some event." Amy frowned. The name was familiar. She didn't understand why, but just hearing it made her heart tighten. "Don't think about it," she replied softly, adjusting the blanket over his legs, though her mind was already racing. Max stared out the window of his office, but saw only his own reflection. Outside, there were evening traffic jams, glowing billboards, the hum of cars. His company was thriving, but the inner feeling of emptiness did not disappear. He could buy anything he wanted, but he knew that no purchase, no possession, could rectify the past. When his assistant entered the office, Max did not immediately notice him. "Mr. White," began the assistant hesitantly, "we need to approve the plan for the new project." "Leave it on the table, I'll look at it later," he replied shortly, not turning his head. The assistant left, leaving the folder with the plans. Max returned to his thoughts. He recalled the accident, although he tried to avoid it. Part of his soul had been shattered that day, and no matter how much he tried to atone for his guilt, it always seemed insufficient. He was lost in thought until the phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. Max didn't like answering such calls, but something urged him to press the answer button. "Hello, is this Max White?" The voice on the other end was female but tense. "Yes, speaking." "Sorry to bother you, my name is Amy. You don't know me, but I want to thank you for your help." Max froze. "Help? What help?" he replied slowly. "I know it was you who paid for my daughter's treatment and helped with the apartment," Amy continued. "I was told by the charity that you are our sponsor, although at first they hid your name." Max felt cold sweat trickling down his back. Someone at the charity had broken his anonymity, violating their agreements. "I'm sorry, there must be some mistake. I'm not sure it's me," he said uncertainly. "Why are you denying it?" There was a slight resentment in her voice. "I just wanted to say thank you. It meant everything to us." Max quickly realized that the conversation could go too far. "I'm glad your family received help, but I'm afraid it's not me. I'm sorry, I have to go," he said, ending the call, feeling a rising panic inside. Amy placed her phone down, frowning. White's response was strange, and his tone revealed that he was hiding something. She hadn't expected the conversation to unfold like this. She wasn't seeking gratitude or new sacrifices. She just wanted to understand why someone completely unknown to her decided to help them, but his reaction made her wonder. "Did you call?" Dan asked, wheeling over to the table in his wheelchair. "Yes, but he denies everything," she replied thoughtfully. Dan furrowed his brow. "Maybe it's really not him. I feel like he's lying. But why? What's with this strange anonymity?" Amy whispered, not realizing how loudly she'd spoken. Dan looked at her attentively, but said nothing. Max turned on his computer and entered the password to log into the system. His internal discomfort was growing. He understood that this conversation with Amy wouldn't go unnoticed. If she wanted, she could dig deeper. He pulled out that document from the drawer, stamped "Case Closed." It contained information about the accident, the details, witnesses, and the investigation's conclusions. There was also the address of the family who lost everything that day. It matched the address the charity had given him to assist. A chill ran through him. Max sat motionless, holding the document in his hands. All the details formed a picture that struck his nerves harder than he could bear. Amy and Dan's family was the same one whose life had been destroyed in that accident. He remembered that day in minute detail. He had been rushing to an important meeting, barely managing to control his new car. There was no alcohol in his blood, but his mind was in chaos. He had just fought with a business partner, which caused him to miss a major deal. That was when it all happened at one of the intersections. The investigation found Max responsible for the accident, but his lawyers maneuvered the case so he avoided serious punishment. It all came down to a fine and compensation for the family of the woman who died. But what could possibly compensate for a lost life, shattered destinies? He knew that money couldn't heal such wounds. Several years had passed since then, and he tried to forget the incident, but now the past had caught up with him again. Amy couldn't sleep. Dan had long fallen asleep, but her thoughts kept her restless. She felt that there was more to their benefactor's anonymity. She picked up her phone again and started searching for information about Max White. His name was ever present in the headlines: successful businessman, billionaire, philanthropist. But delving deeper, she came across an old news story about the accident he had been involved in. White had not admitted guilt, despite witness testimonies. Amy shuddered as she remembered the day when a luxury car had suddenly flown at them. A flash of light, a deafening crash, then pain and screams. She didn't know what the driver looked like, but this news made her wonder. Could it be him? Flashed through her mind. Amy felt her heart pounding faster. She glanced at the sleeping Dan. He didn't need new stress, but now she couldn't just turn a blind eye. The next morning, Max decided to act. He knew Amy might start digging deeper, and this would lead to disaster. He called his assistant. "Jim, find me a contact at the charity who passed money to the family," he said without further explanation. Jim was slightly surprised, but didn't ask questions. "Of course, Mr. White. I'll find out in a couple of hours." Once the assistant left, Max pondered how to fix the situation. He didn't want the family to learn that he was the person who had ruined their lives. He thought it best to stay anonymous, but deep down, he knew that continuing to hide was cowardice. Meanwhile, Amy decided to verify her suspicions. She found the lawyer who had handled the case and booked an appointment. She managed to get details of the investigation, which only confirmed her belief that Max White was involved in their tragedy. Before telling Dan, however, she decided to wait for further evidence. Max reviewed the reports from the charity sent to him by Jim. His fingers tapped nervously on the table as he read the details of the aid provided. Each line felt like a stab to the heart. Payment for a costly operation, purchase of a wheelchair, monthly support to cover the daughter's treatment expenses. He recalled insisting on these expenses himself. Back then, he thought it might ease their suffering a little. But now he realized money couldn't erase the pain of loss. Jim entered the office, holding a printed report. "Here are the contacts of the person who might have disclosed your anonymity," he said. Max glanced through the document. It was Michael Ross, a new employee of the charity. Perhaps he didn't understand the series of events he was triggering by making such a call. "Get in touch with him. I want to meet," Max ordered briefly. Amy sat across from the lawyer, who weakly smiled, noticing her tense face. "You mentioned you needed the case details," he began, pulling out a folder. "Yes, it concerns my family," she firmly replied. The lawyer hummed, seemingly surprised by her determination. "It's an old case," he noted. "Back then, everything was closed in the investigation phase. But yes, I remember. White managed to avoid severe repercussions." "What do you mean?" Amy asked. "He had an excellent lawyer. They presented evidence that he lost control not through his own fault. Everything was blamed on a car defect. The manufacturer even paid compensation to avoid a lawsuit. And the reality?" Her voice echoed skepticism. The lawyer raised his eyebrows. "Amy," he said gently, "in such cases, the truth is rarely sought. Money and connections play a bigger role." His words amplified her suspicions. "But what do you personally think?" she insisted. The lawyer pondered for a moment. "I believe he was culpable, but proving it was impossible then." Amy left the office with a heavy heart. Now she knew that Max White was not only their benefactor, but also the person whose negligence had ruined their lives. Max's meeting with Michael Ross occurred at the charity's office. The young employee clearly felt nervous in front of the famed businessman. "I want to understand why you breached confidentiality," Max questioned. Michael hesitated. "I'm sorry. I didn't realize it was so important. I just wanted the family to know who helped them. Do you understand that what you did could have serious consequences?" Max looked him in the eye. Michael guiltily lowered his head. "I won't do it again," he promised. Max sighed heavily, sensing that reprimanding the young man was pointless. The problem wasn't with him, it was that the truth was bound to emerge eventually. Meanwhile, Amy recounted what she had learned to Dan. "Are you sure?" he asked, gripping the armrests. "Yes, Dan, it's him. It all lines up." "Why would he help us then?" His voice expressed disbelief. Amy paused momentarily. "Perhaps it's his way of atoning for his guilt?" Dan turned away, staring out the window. He didn't know how to react. On one hand, their savior was the cause of their woes. On the other, without his help, they might not have survived. "What do you plan to do?" he finally asked. "I want to meet with him," Amy said firmly. Amy prepared for the meeting with Max for a long time. Doubts plagued her. Would he confess or deny everything? She imagined multiple versions of how it might go, but none eased her mind. She wrote a letter addressed personally to Max, in which she succinctly outlined her request to meet and talk. Amy attached a copy of the accident article and photos of her family before and after the tragedy to the letter. She knew this left him little room to refuse. The letter was delivered through the charity's office. A day later, Max's response arrived. He agreed to meet. On the chosen day, Amy stood before the glass doors of the upscale restaurant Max had selected. It felt alien to her, the glitz, expensive interiors, waiters who seemed to have stepped off a magazine cover. But her objective was more important. Despite the discomfort, she stepped in. Max was already waiting for her at a secluded table in the corner. When she approached, he stood to greet her. "Amy," he said calmly, extending his hand. She ignored the gesture and sat across from him. "I didn't come here for pleasantries," she said sharply. Max lowered his hand and nodded slightly. "I understand." His tone was restrained, almost neutral, but anxiety was visible in his eyes. "Let's begin." Amy took out the printed article from her bag. "You were behind the wheel of that car?" Max looked at the article and then at her. His face remained impassive. "Yes," he finally said. "I was." Amy clenched her fists, feeling anger mounting inside her. "Why didn't you admit it then? Why didn't you take responsibility?" Max sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Because honestly, I was scared of losing everything I had, my business, reputation, the life I had built. And our lives didn't matter." Her voice trembled. "They mattered," he said quietly, "and they still do. That's why I tried to help." Amy let out a bitter laugh. "Help? You think money can fix what you've done?" "No," he quickly replied, "but it was all I could do." Amy studied him silently, searching for any sincerity in his words. "Why now? Why anonymously?" she asked finally. "Because I didn't want you to know." Max lowered his gaze. "I thought it would be better, for you, for all of us." She frowned. "Or for you?" He was silent, aware that her words reflected the truth. He had only thought of how to preserve the remnants of his conscience, without realizing that his actions might cause even more pain. When Amy returned home, Dan was waiting for her in the kitchen. "How did it go?" he asked, clasping a mug of tea. She sank into a chair, exhausted and drained. "He admitted everything," she said. "And he didn't justify himself. Said he was sorry, but that doesn't bring Mom back." Her voice broke, and she quickly covered her face with her hands. Dan wheeled closer, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I understand," he said softly. "So what now?" he asked. Amy raised her eyes to him. "I don't know." She felt crushed. How could she forgive someone who had destroyed their lives? And how to reconcile with the fact that his help had saved them from total ruin? Max returned to his office, gazing at an old photograph. It was a snapshot from a past when he was young, carefree, and confident the world was at his feet. Back then, he never would have imagined that one mistake could break others' lives and alter his own forever. There was a knock on the door. "Max, I found everything. I have the details of the accident you asked to verify," Jim began, entering with a folder. It turned out not to be as simple as it appeared then. The investigation had data suggesting the car malfunction was intentional. Jim placed the documents before him. "Someone tampered with the brakes." Max flinched at the words. "Intentionally," his voice came out hoarse. "Yes, it all points to someone trying to set you up," Jim confirmed. "Who could have done this?" Max felt nausea rising. Jim shrugged. "Evidence points to one of your former business partners, Charlie Stillman. Back then, he was actively trying to edge you out of the market. Maybe it was his attempt." Max stared at the papers silently. Stillman's name was too familiar. They indeed had their hostilities, and Charlie never hid his desire to take Max's place. But the fact that he might have gone to such lengths shocked Max. "He destroyed their lives for mine," Max said quietly, feeling the weight of guilt intensifying. Meanwhile, Amy found an old notebook that belonged to her mother. She flipped through pages filled with her mother's handwriting, hoping to find something to help her cope. One page caught her attention. "Life is unfair, but our strength is in how we react. Amy, if you ever read this, remember, hatred destroys us and forgiveness makes us stronger." Those words made her stop and think. She was filled with anger, but could that change the past? That evening, Dan suggested they speak with Max again. If he truly regrets, maybe it's our way to move forward, he said cautiously. Amy looked at her husband with surprise. "You're talking about forgiveness?" "I'm talking about freeing ourselves from this burden," Dan replied. Amy hesitated, but knew Dan was right. Hatred wouldn't bring back her mother or heal old wounds. But could she forgive Max, even if he confessed the whole truth? When they met again, Max was ready to talk. This time he held the folder Jim had brought. "I need to tell you something important," he began. Amy and Dan watched him intently. "Many years ago I did drive that car, but the accident happened not solely because of me. The braking system was deliberately sabotaged. I was set up. Like a bolt from the blue," Amy repeated. "Who?" "A former partner of mine," Max replied, lowering his gaze. "I've only recently discovered this." Amy looked at him, uncertain whether to believe him. "And you think this justifies you?" she coldly asked. "No," he said firmly. "It doesn't justify me. I am still to blame. I made the wrong choices when I should have spoken the truth." Dan suddenly spoke. "You tried to rectify it, Max, and for that, I respect you." Amy turned to her husband in surprise. "Dan, we can't bring back the past, but we can try to amend our future," he said, gazing into her eyes. Tears filled Amy's eyes. She knew Dan was right, but the decision was still hard for her. Max returned home feeling empty. He knew he had done everything he could, but forgiveness is something that cannot be begged or bought. It has to be sincere and voluntary. From that day on, he decided to dedicate his life to helping others who found themselves in similar situations. He resolved that his life would now be devoted to supporting those in need. As the days turned into weeks, Amy and Dan slowly began to piece their lives back together. Max's confession and their confrontation had stirred up emotions they thought they'd buried, but it also provided a sense of closure they desperately needed. While the pain of their loss would never fully disappear, the understanding of the full truth allowed them to start healing. One afternoon, as Amy was going through some old family photos, she received an unexpected letter. It was from Max. Her hands trembled as she opened the envelope, revealing a heartfelt note. Max expressed his continued remorse and shared his plans to establish a scholarship in their daughter, Annie's name, to help other children in need of medical assistance. Reading the letter, Amy's emotions were conflicted. A part of her was still angry, but another part began to see Max's efforts in a new light. Perhaps this was his way of trying to bring something good from the tragedy he once caused. Dan, when he learned about the letter, remained quiet for a while. Finally, he spoke. "Maybe it's his way of finding redemption. We don't have to forget, but maybe we can find a way to forgive." His words lingered in the air, a gentle nudge towards a future where they could release the burden of hatred and embrace healing. As for Max, he immersed himself in his new mission. He found peace in knowing that his contributions could make a difference in the lives of those he helped. Every person he assisted was a step towards the redemption he sought, even if it was just in his conscience. Gradually, Amy and Dan began to participate in community activities, focusing on helping others as well. It became their way of paying forward the unexpected kindness they had received. While the scars of the past remained, they no longer held them back from moving forward. Time, with its patient persistence, allowed the wounds to heal. Max, Amy, and Dan continued on paths that were forever changed by their encounter, each finding a different form of peace and purpose. In the end, they all learned that even amidst pain and loss, life offered opportunities for forgiveness, healing, and new beginnings. Did you enjoy this story? Tell us your thoughts in the comments, give this video a thumbs up, and subscribe to the channel to not miss new releases. See you soon.